All right, so welcome. Today we're going to be talking about decolonizing the built environment. Before I introduce myself and we begin, I am going to open with a territorial acknowledgement. Today finds me on the traditional territory of Treaty 6, the homeland of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose hearts and footsteps have crossed these lands since time immemorial, also known as Amiskwichi, Waskahagan, or Edmonton, Alberta. Edmonton has been home to many First Nations, Métis, Inuit since time immemorial and has been a traditional gathering place and meeting place. And I encourage folks to think about whose hearts and footsteps have crossed the lands and their relationship with land spirit and the truth and reconciliation efforts that are being made in your area. So a little bit about me. So my name is Jessica Vandenberg. My pronouns are she, her. I grew up in northern Alberta in what's known as Treaty 8 territory. I am a 60 scoop survivor. I am part of the Denetah First Nation, which is in Treaty 8 territory, up close to the center known as High Level. I grew up close to the center known as Grand Prairie, which you can see on this map here, down here. I grew up close to the center of Grand Prairie in a farming family. We lived on two different farms in the area, one close to Webster and one close to the small hamlet of Woking. I found my way up to Spirit River, where my high school was, and then eventually down to Grand Prairie to the regional college in an engineering transfer program that took me out to Edmonton to attend the University of Alberta. I did two engineering degrees, one in chemical engineering and a joint one between chemical and mining engineering. And I've been so blessed to have my career take me many different places across the country. And I currently work for the University of Victoria and am owner of Guiding Star Consulting. I'm a mom. I come from many family lines, including my adopted family lines, and am so thankful that I can come to you today and share the knowledge that has been shared with me through many elders and knowledge keepers, as well as through technical experience and education that I've received along the way. So I do really want to acknowledge all of those who have taught me along the way so I can bring this information and material to you. So when we're talking about the building environment, when building, we are really working in the interest of the greater good. Typically, we're not doing a build project for ourselves. We're doing it for a client. We're doing it for a community. We're doing it for people who will be using it long past the build and construction phases and design phases that we will be involved in. And so we need to think about the impact of what we're making, not just now, but into the future. When we think about incorporating truth reconciliation into the built environment, when we think about how we can decolonize these environments, we need to really lead with reconciliation change. We need to start by learning and accepting the truth. This presentation will touch lightly upon the truth. We need to figure out how to work and create meaningful and trusted relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities, especially if they're impacted by our projects and works. So thinking not just now, but into the future, and also thinking retroactively to whose hearts and footsteps have crossed those lands before us. We might be building on a hereditary lands or ancestral lands of nations that are no longer in the vicinity, but still have spiritual and meaning tied to the lands where our project is happening. We can think about how we can change our project management and risk assessments and frameworks so we make space for Indigenous ways of being and relating and proper engagement. And we can make room for Indigenous ways in engineering, science, and building. So to do all of that, we have to, of course, build safe, brave, inclusive spaces for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit colleagues and ensure equitable supports. So this looks like examining our own policies, recruitment and retention strategies, and making inclusive changes. So a lot of things to think about. In today's presentation, we'll be ideating on some of those things, and I'll be sharing pieces of information around this to hopefully give you places to get curious about to further explore in your own studies. So we're going to start with the truth. And I just always want to acknowledge that the truth sometimes can create uncomfortable feelings, but feeling uncomfortable about a situation is oftentimes an indicator that growth is about to take place. And so I often share this graphic as well related to truth reconciliation work. It's really acknowledging that there are a number of zones that we go through in our mindset and the feelings that bubble up as we engage with this content, that we need to see and know that they're there, and work through as we go back and forth with different material. And depending what you're engaging with, you might go back and forth between these zones. So for example, maybe the first time you're doing your first authentic land acknowledgement, maybe that'll put you in the fear zone. You're not quite sure how to write it. You're not worried about pronunciation. You're worried about offending people. You're wondering how to incorporate this in an authentic way. Maybe you're presenting to a room full of colleagues and you have a bit of a fear of judgment or backlash or repercussion that keeps you in that fear zone. But as you practice, as you learn more, as you talk to other people who may or may not have done this before, you get some guidance from your Indigenous colleagues, you'll enter that learning zone. And through practice and life experience, you'll move into that growth zone. And giving authentic land acknowledgements might become something very comfortable to you. But maybe the first time then that you engage with a ceremony, you're in attendance of a ceremony or a participant, or you're headed into an Indigenous community for the first time, maybe that again will put you back into the fear zone. And as you engage with colleagues and talk with your Indigenous colleagues and content that might have been curated by Indigenous peoples, or talk with people who have done and been through that experience before, and you grow and learn, you'll move back and forth between these zones. And so I really, again, want to acknowledge people are everywhere in their learning journey, including our First Nations, Métis, Inuit people. As someone who's First Nations, my K-12 experience didn't tell me anything of the truth, if anything, very lightly, and sometimes some misinformation. As an adult, I've done my own personal journey of exploration into truth and reconciliation, talking with Indigenous peoples, reading content, sitting with elders and knowledge keepers. And so I just want to acknowledge that even First Nations, Métis, Inuit people aren't always, don't always know the truth either. And so we're all on a learning journey together. All right, so when we talk about truth and reconciliation, it is adjacent to equity, diversity, inclusion work, as well as the conversations around different identities. So as we think through different pieces and components of an individual, there are a number of things that are core to us and a number of things that we may or may not have control over, and then a number of things that society pressures us into going into certain directions. And so this is a diversity wheel. On the inner circle, the dark circle that's not colored, are typically traits that we are born with, that come with us. So things like age. Age is something that you can't change. I am the age I am. I can lie about that, but it doesn't change the age that I am. The sexual orientation and gender type that I was born with is still with me today. That is something that stayed with me. My race and ethnicity is the same. Physical ability and quality. There are things that people are born with genetically. There are things that vary throughout your lifetime depending on the experiences that you have. But the ones that you're born with stay with you till and are part of you until the day that you move on to the spirit world. The things on the outer circle are sometimes things that we have control over. Some countries have more freedom in some of these areas. So for example, military experience. There are countries where it's mandatory that everyone serves in the military for a portion of their careers and lives. We live in the country of Canada where it's not mandated for military experience. In our country here, again, we have freedom to marry who we choose for marital status. We also have freedom of religious belief in some countries where that's not the case. So these are things that shape who we are and in our identity. In terms of Indigenous ancestries and indigeneity, as some folks call it, these are also part of who we are. But because of societal, the way this society is shaped and formed, it has different exposure and experience as you live as with that aspect of your identity in our country here. And so I'll go a little bit more into truth reconciliation, but wanted to share this to show that there are many aspects of intersectionality. There are many aspects of identities that have been marginalized and oppressed, sometimes actively oppressed by societies and countries that you live in. And so just recognizing that everybody's lived experience may or may not have taken them through significant life changes and traumatic experiences. And as we talk about the truth, we need to recognize the trauma that comes with First Nations, Métis, Inuit experiences living and growing up in this country. But really, all of our identity types, no matter the things that we've been through, we all are striving for the same things. So we all want to be treated with respect, regardless of our identity. And that's really what Truth and Reconciliation is aiming for. It's not aiming for saying that my hurt is bigger than your hurt. It's not aiming for trying to minimalize other people's identities in favor of elevating others. It's really around trying to move everyone forward and remove any of the barriers and discrimination and racism that might exist systemically within our country and within our policies and legislations. And so that leads us to trying to see Canada through the eyes of the truth. Truth and reconciliation efforts have been underway for decades and decades and decades. It's gained momentum, more momentum, off and on, depending on political parties and advocacy and funding and things like that. But it is something that we continue to work on and strive towards until we get to a place of progressive legislation, a place of healing, and a place of reciprocity. All right. So we're going to go through the truth. I always give folks a bit of a trigger warning for this. So if you are a First Nations, Métis, Inuit ancestry, if you've been through similar traumatic experiences, please do, if you find the material triggering, take your time to do your self-care and wellness checks and make sure that you look after yourself as well. We all are at different places in our healing journey. So I just want to recognize that Indigenous peoples who reside here in Canada, North America, or Turtle Island, as we refer to it sometimes, may have been affected in their own countries. We are a very ethnically diverse country with a lot of countries who are going through decolonization efforts and their own truth reconciliation commissions and their own human rights movements as well. So just recognizing that Indigenous peoples to Canada aren't the only ones who have been going through a journey of truth and reconciliation. So going back many, many years to time immemorial, so over 20,000 years ago, First Nations people and Inuit to the north have occupied what's known now as North America and often referred to as Turtle Island. Numbers were in the millions of individuals that made and called this homes. Indigenous peoples had their own ways of knowing, being, doing, relating. They had their own ways of governance, of civilization, of engineering and technology. They had cities, they had mineral working, they had dentistry, they had agricultural methods that could feed large amounts of people. And they had an environmental consciousness that kept the lands in pristine condition. They found ways to handle conflict. They found ways of working together in trade and commerce. And they had ways that allowed people to thrive, even through conflict and disagreement. Things dramatically changed as European countries took interest in what's now known as North America. Lots of exploration was done in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Of expeditions sent where they quote unquote discovered North America. But in actuality, they came and interacted with the First Nations and Inuit peoples who were occupying these lands and had for a long time. The countries that dominated the exploration at the time were England, France, and Spain. And we see that influence still into today. The Spanish influence is quite heavy still in South America, in Central America, and the southern states. The French influence we see in what's now known as the United States, as well as here in Canada, where we have the province of Quebec, as well as the second official language being French. The England occupation and colonization of what's now known as Canada was really dominant, though. They fought for the lands. They ended up taking and putting into place mechanisms in order to declare Canada a colony of England. So I'm going to continue into the truth, but I wanted to pause for a second and just really recognize that I use the term Indigenous, which encompasses three very distinct demographic groups. So we have First Nations, we have Métis, we have Inuit. First Nation groups, as recognized by the federal government, number over 620. We know there are hereditary families and ancestral lines that number beyond that. The federal government doesn't always recognize nations as distinct as well. And there are a couple examples that I'll give you. So in Treaty 7, close to the center now known as Calgary, there is the Stoney Nakoda Nation, which is seen as one nation in the eyes of the government, of the federal government, but really is three distinct nations with their own distinct chief and councils and lands that are geographically quite separate from each other and have different needs, but they're seen as one nation. There are other nations that are listed as extinct, who the federal government doesn't recognize any of the ancestral lines that still exist. There are a number of members of some of these nations that are across the borders in the United States and cannot re-enter Canada because their nation isn't recognized. There are nations that have never been recognized as well. Here in Treaty 6 territory, the two examples are the Papas Chase First Nation, as well as the Michelle Band, both never recognized by the federal government, but whose ancestral lines and ties to the lands are immense in this area. And so lots of complications and nuance within just the terminology First Nations. Métis, often the misconception for Métis is that any First Nations European blood mix makes a person Métis, which isn't quite true. Ancestral lines need to trace back to those early unions of European explorers and First Nations people. Typically, ancestral lines will tie back to families that settled around the mouth of the Hudson's Bay, so into modern day Manitoba, Northern Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, and up into Nunavut, as well as into the territories. Métis ancestral lines, their advocacy and culture has grown out of those early unions, but has resulted in a very distinct and beautiful mix of cultural and language and traditions. Our Inuit cousins to the north have been here since time immemorial as well. Their culture and traditions and language are quite different than First Nations. Their stories even of Turtle Island and their cultural ceremonies that they take part in are quite distinct from First Nations and Métis. So they're recognized as their own distinct demographic. So I just wanted to provide that clarification that today, mainly I'll be talking from a First Nations perspective. I'll touch in the truth section upon both the Métis and Inuit, but all three demographics journeys up until today are different. So as you think about this, when you're working with First Nations, Métis, or Inuit colleagues, or working for them as clients or communities impacted by your build projects, the approach does vary amongst all of them. And I will be utilizing the terminology Indigenous at times as well, which is meant to encompass all of them, but not to dishonor them by grouping them and generalizing altogether. So I just wanted to pause for a minute and recognize that terminology. All right, so as mentioned at the beginning too, many countries have been colonized by Europe. From this map here, you can see the colored countries all were impacted by colonization by European countries, predominantly those three countries of England, France, and Spain, and all have been undergoing their own truth and reconciliation for their Indigenous peoples and various human rights to move towards their own independency. So colonization had a huge impact in the world. Imperialism was the imposition of European ways over that of the peoples that were colonized. The church played a large influence in this as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. Capitalism, the European way of commerce, replaced traditional ways of trade. That use of religion, church, and power of God very much was tied closely to colonialism and imperialism, saying that authority came from God for the things that were done. And then science, technology, and Western ways of thinking became the dominant practices that were done too. So when we're thinking about the built environment and project management processes, they're primarily based off of European ways. But we need to recognize that there are other ways that we can exchange information, scientific information and technology as well. Global trade and travel have changed the world. In this country that we live in here, we have quite a mix of different ethnicities. We take in a lot of immigrants, we take in a lot of refugees, and we have people who trace their ancestral homes and homelands to many places other than Canada and North America. All right, so we're going to touch upon the truth here. This is a picture of the residential schools across Canada from 1620 to 1996. It's a very hard to see map, so I'm not going to expect you to read it. The numbers refer to the band numbers within the areas. The dots you can see here are the residential schools pre-Confederation, because there was residential schools for centuries prior to 1867, and then post-Confederation when the Indian Act went into effect, as well as the green ones were Indian hospitals. We'll talk to segregation in the medical system in just a second, and Indian day schools were the yellow dots. And so quite a few across the country. And so when we talk about the truth, there are many things that we don't talk about. Residential schools is one that is becoming more known. We don't really talk about slavery. Brown University estimates that First Nations people in the numbers of between 1.5 and 6 million were part of slavery. We don't always talk about those stories, about the violence and abuse that underwent folks that worked as slaves for European settlers and colonizers. The intentional introduction of disease is also something that we don't talk too much about too. As Europeans came and colonized, they brought new diseases that they didn't always share their cures for with Indigenous peoples. And so to help population control, there were diseases that were intentionally introduced into communities for the impact of reducing population numbers. And the Hudson's Bay blankets, there are many lived experience accounts of smallpox being introduced via Hudson's Bay blankets to communities for that reduction of population. When it comes to the Métis, so again, the Métis are those early unions between European explorers and First Nations people. In the beginning, the rivers and the waterways were the roadways. And so a lot of settlements came around this mouth of Hudson's Bay. And a lot of explorers took the river systems throughout Western Canada into different parts of what's now known as Canada. Métis families started their ancestral lines a lot settling down here into what's known as common day Manitoba in the Winnipeg area. And so families grew, families settled prior to there being a system or a framework for land property ownership. And so when folks were trying to take and stake their claim over lands, they invented a system called scrip. So scrip was meant to be a way to do land acquisition, taking the lands from Métis people whose families had lived in those areas for generations. Scrip was like a promissory note. It was given to Métis families to say, we're going to take this land where you're residing right now, and we're going to give you this promise that you're going to get some land somewhere else at some point, or you're going to be monetarily compensated at some point. Scrip was never implemented. It was a highly corrupt system. And what resulted were road allowance communities. So Métis traveled to the west waiting for scrip to give them the land that was promised or money. They found that they could settle in the road allowances that ran next to roads and highways. So the ditches where utilities ran and wastewater ran. They made their communities there. They were non-serviced areas, low socioeconomic areas. And road allowance communities existed until about 2006, with people being born in road allowance communities and living their whole life in those areas. Again, waiting for this promise of scrip. One of the most oppressive pieces of legislation globally is the Indian Act. So the Indian Act went into effect shortly after Canada was established in 1867 as a colony. This is one of the world's most oppressive pieces of legislation, and there's so much that goes into that. I'm going to recommend that you read Bob Joseph's 24 Things You Don't Know About the Indian Act, sorry, 21 Things You Don't Know About the Indian Act. It goes into a lot more detail, but out of the Indian Act came systems like member status systems. The reserve systems came out of it. A lot of gender discrimination, this idea of enfranchisement, establishment of government control over Indigenous peoples and communities, how funding would work. All these things came out of that. And this act is still in effect today. So we are sitting with this oppressive piece of legislation when other countries around the world have already moved towards progressive legislation for their Indigenous peoples, such as New Zealand. So again, one of those concepts within the Indian Act was enfranchisement. Enfranchisement was this idea that First Nations people had something genetically that just made them closer to animals than humans, that they were savages, that they were beasts, and that as if they adopted and learned European ways, that would move them closer to being humans and being civilized, civilized being defined by European people. And so if you did things that indicated that you were civilized, that meant you were enfranchised. So for example, if you educated yourself, if you went to university, that would mean that you have denied your Indigenous ways of culture and traditions and language that you had known and your ancestors had known for centuries to go to European ways and Christian belief. If Indigenous women married European men, that meant you were going to raise your family in European ways. And so you lost your status, not just for yourself, but for all your future generations, with this idea that you were going to civilize your children from then on into the future. Enfranchisement was in effect from prior to the Indian Act going into effect up until 1985. Other tactics taken. So I mentioned imperialism. Imperialism was, again, this imposition of European ways, but ways of trying to influence populations in certain directions. One of these tactics was one of elimination of crucial things in people's lives. So elimination of the plains buffalo was a tactic taken in order to remove this thing that was held sacred and was crucial to how First Nations in the plains lived their lives. Buffalo and bison were animals that were sacred. They represented respect, the teaching of respect, but they also supplied them with food, with tools, with furs, with clothing, all sorts of things were supplied by this animal. Europeans actively hunted bison to the point of extinction. And although now we see the value of them, there are efforts being done to reintroduce them into the wild, to re-raise them and present them back to nations. But really, Europeans were trying to drive replacement with their own idea of valued livestock, which were cattle and sheep and different livestock. The Indian Act, of course, also gave authority to what's known as residential schools. Through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've heard a lot of lived experience. We've witnessed a lot of things from people that have happened to them in those schools. Residential schools worked in concert with the Indian agents who actively went and gathered children from the reserves and put them in these schools. The schools were often geographically far from the community. They were boarded there, and they were operated in conjunction with the churches. So it was an imposition of Christian belief. It was actively, through abuse and violence, trying to erase Indigenous identity, in concert with laws as well that banned cultural practices and banned use of language and banned all sorts of different things that are associated with Indigenous identity. These schools operated prior to Confederation up until 1997. And the accounts of these schools from the people and the children who went to these schools was not that of education. It wasn't simply just teaching them another way of life. It was an imposition through abuse and violence, often resulting in death of children as well. So quite a few children lost their lives in those schools through the abuse. It was meant to break apart family ties as well and community ties. And it was meant to really, really do the cultural genocide that we now recognize as a truth. We don't always talk about the day schools either. So we talk about the residential schools, 139 across the country, but there was also 700 day schools. And so the difference between the two is that children were boarded at the residential schools, so they lived there throughout the school year. The day schools, they went to the school and then went back home. And so the way the day schools were run were similar to residential schools, again, not for education. It was meant for assimilation and oppression. And those day schools also operated till the year 2000. We hear the story of survivors. And just in the fact that we call anyone who came out of these schools survivors and not graduates shows that it was something that wasn't meant for the health and positive growth of our children. It was meant for oppression. Segregation was also done in different aspects of life too, such as the medical system. And so Indian hospitals was a way of segregating Indigenous peoples from the rest of the people within the public. So Indian hospitals, there were 29 that operated across this country until 1981. They were run as well in conjunction with the churches. Often they were used as places to separate families, separate people from their community. It encouraged people to take part in things like the foster adoption systems and convert to different faiths. There are a lot of lived experience accounts as well of unmarked graves associated with the Indian hospitals too. My family and my story, I was born in an Indian hospital that still stands here in Edmonton. Both my parents went to residential school in the north, along with a lot of my ancestors for many, many generations. My brothers and sisters and cousins and grandparents, everybody went to the residential schools. Medical testing is also something when we talk about medical segregation. Medical testing, there's a lot of accounts from elders and knowledge keepers and families that the children who went to the schools were medically tested upon too. And it's a variety of ways. You often see scars on our elders and they'll talk about them if they feel comfortable. But even malnutrition tests, how our Canada Food Guide came about was through malnutrition tests on children to find the minimum amount of vitamins and minerals a youth body requires in order to be healthy, which meant there was a fraction of the population that were below that and intentionally starved and malnourished in order to figure out those thresholds. When we talk about our Inuit to the north, the imperialistic tactic taking on the Inuit to the north was the Inuit dog slaughter. This took place over the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in conjunction with the RCMP, who were given the authority to slaughter all the Inuit dogs. Inuit dogs were a crucial part of Inuit life, meant for transportation, but also the dogs were part of their families. They had long lines of ancestral dogs going back for generations. They hold a prestigious place within the community. And they were intentionally slaughtered again to the point of extinction to remove a crucial part of Inuit communities and Inuit life in order to help with the conversion and assimilation into European ways. When it comes to the medical side of things too, so all these tactics were done, again, to reduce populations of Indigenous peoples, to assimilate them into European ways, through targeting children, through separation from community, from very harsh cutoff from cultural and language and traditional ways. When all of that didn't work and what was resulted in were abused children and segregation in communities and the oppression that was done to communities, the next tactic that was tried was forced sterilization of Indigenous women. the idea of this was that the government wanted to just stop Indigenous people from reproducing. And so Indigenous women, when they went for medical help into hospitals, whether it was Indian hospitals or public hospitals, were forcibly sterilized, sometimes without consent or even knowledge that that was happening. And this oppressive piece of work was even legislated in at least two of the provinces that I know of, so in Alberta and BC for several decades. And right now, even the federal government is working to remove the remnants of this in our systems, but it takes a very long time. So these are things that still exist as practices, but still have work to be done in terms of truth reconciliation. The last two that I'm going to mention are the 60 scoop and millennial scoop. And that's, again, is removing of children into European Christian families through the foster adoption system. 60 scoopers are found around the world, ads having been placed. We know now interracial adoption requires a lot of thought and care and connection back to original families. That wasn't done as part of 60 scoop and millennial scoop. It was full cut off from their communities. I am a 60 scoop survivor. I was adopted into a European Christian family, Catholic family, and adopted geographically very far from my home community. And right or wrong, my family was advised to tell me my whole birth family was dead. So it was meant for cutoff, it was meant for segregation, and it was meant for assimilation into European Christian ways. Millennial scoop is similar. It's the high numbers of Indigenous people in the foster adoption system still being placed into European Christian families, but with more measures now in effect for interracial adoption. So that is a lot. That is a lot of truth, a lot of things that we don't learn in our K-12 systems, in our adult life. A lot more stories are coming forward from lived experience of different things that are happened, and lots of active work being done to shift systemic things to contribute to this, like having that oppressive piece of legislation called the Indian Act. A lot of things going into effect to remove things from provincial legislation, to remove practices in organizations and bodies, and to move us towards a place of healing and reciprocity. But again, part of what is difficult in this country and moving it forward is that we do have people from all over the world. And this, again, is a very detailed slide, but really what I want you to see is this trend starting in the 1830s up until 2010 of when Canada opened its doors to immigration and refugees. And so we have a huge mix of different ethnicities within this country. From Census 2021, we have people from India, Philippines, China, Syria, Nigeria, the United States, Pakistan, France, Iran, United Kingdom. And then this bubble graph shows it a little bit more, that when we ask people their ethnic origins as part of the census, we have quite the mix here in Canada, which means we have many ways of knowing, being, doing, and relating. We have many ways of spiritual belief. We have many different ways of trying to figure out how we all work together. And we have many different things that we need to overcome to move us towards inclusivity. And we see that our First Nations people, our Metis people, our Inuit people are of low numbers because of everything that's happened with colonization. We went from being 100% of the population to less than 10% of the population. And so our power and ability to advocate for change doesn't have as loud of a voice without the help of allies and without the help of people considering how to incorporate truth and reconciliation into all aspects of their professional life and hopefully their personal lives as well. So truth and reconciliation really is all of our responsibility. So what do we do? What do we do with all that information? We need to recognize that there is privilege and power and systemic discrimination built into our country. We can see it in our project teams at times, in project frameworks, in the built environment, and it shows up in decision-making about who's being consulted or engaged. We can be conscious of that and then shift it and change it. We can call in colleagues when privilege and power, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination and racism is at play. It takes different forms that we don't always think about or don't always know until somebody points them out to us. So simple things like business jargon, for example, things that have gone out of that are moving out of business language because of truth reconciliation are things like let's circle the wagons, people are off the reservation, let's talk to the person who's higher on the totem pole. Let's call a powwow of everybody. These are things that came from places of oppression. Making room for Indigenous voices throughout engagement and consultation at all stages of a project. So ideally, you want your project teams to be diverse. That may or may not be realistic and feasible depending on the company that you work for and depending on who is part of your team. But we can call and have Indigenous voices at the table through engagement efforts at different parts of our projects. In order to do that, though, we need to understand Indigenous protocol. We need to follow that when engaging with Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers and community members and honor their contribution and voices to our projects. And when they come and engage with us, we need to actively listen. It's not about us trying to impose our designs on them and our builds and what we think. I know we can get excited and passionate about what we have to share, but we need to give them reciprocal time in order to be passionate and care about what they are sharing with us too. So whether they're part of our teams or they're landowners or simply people who are impacted by our project now into the future, we need to truly listen to them. We need to ensure that human rights are protected, and we need to help with culture and language restoration, especially in design and architecture. So that could look like simple things like translating your technical reports into a local language or including a land acknowledgement and a recognition of treaty rights as part of a report. So I have a couple of graphic project and built designs that do a really great job of integrating Indigenous culture through consultation with the communities that they're working with into their designs. So this is a cultural center in Moberly Lake, BC, that includes this nice, beautiful hut design into the cultural center itself, a fire and a meeting place outside that works with the environment around it. The design of the First Nations University worked with an Indigenous architect, one of the Cardinal brothers, into the design. You can see this beautiful teepee glass design, as well as artwork around it that complements and helps with culture and language restoration as well. We see this one from Quebec, another cultural center that really builds on the log house and the longhouse designs. I don't know the details of this one, but they might have even harvested these pieces of wood in traditional ways as part of this. And likely as part of the build, they did blessings of the building itself when it was opened and launched. But you can see design as well as traditional methods of building incorporated into this as well. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you as part of this is this short video on one of the Edmonton city parks. Through a collaborative project between the City of Edmonton and the Edmonton Arts Council and the local communities, they really wanted to incorporate cultural integration and language integration into this park design. So I am going to share this with you. And just let me know that you can hear the sound, hey?
The most important part about this park is it's going to tell the history of Edmonton, because, we tend to lose a lot of history as time goes on, right? And people change, cultures, there's new cultures, and it changes it too, right? So, and this park will really tell the story.
I wanted to make a piece that was about the language and the importance of language, but also really about Indigenous women, to represent and to honor Indigenous women.
Our name is derived from the sound of the birds in our homeland. So it was the robin. So the sound of the robin was Tzawitzali. And so we were then called the Tzawadeno. And I was thinking about that when I was seeing all the magpies flying around here. And I thought, oh, those are very beautiful birds. And then I thought, I guess every place has its particular presence, and it will have its own particular sound.
I have tried to capture a few different creatures that had lived in this area from the past 67 million years, over 100 million years, up until the present. The creatures that I have chosen are indicative of the life cycle and the cycle of trophic cascade that has occurred that is unique to their period in history. So for example, with the dinosaur era, there's a hadrosaur and the Albertosaurus, or also known as Gorgosaurus, predator and prey. And then fast forward several million years, and you have the coyote and the hare, which are featured as bronzes. So there's a bronze coyote sitting on top of this large red piece of granite, as well as, and then the bronze hare, which is lying behind the granite where the coyote can't see.
I really want to pay honor to the process that was created by the Edmonton Arts Council with curator Candice Hopkins about this idea of gathering around this place. And there are lots of stories that talk about the people that came through this area and continue to come through this area. And I wanted to really make a mark of that specifically. And so what I've done is I've created amphitheater style seating, 4 steps, and then it is connected to a sacred circle at the base. And so for me, it's really about Métis culture coming together with the European seating and the sacred circle stemming from Indigenous people. And the 4 steps all relate to different periods of time. So the top step is really to prehistoric time. The 3rd step, it is really to mark the fort era. So it has wood on the surface, and it's to really remind you of the forts, but also Métis cabins. And so at the corner is a dovetail-like joint, which is Métis specific. And the 3rd step, it's related to our contemporary time. So I have water jet cut a beading pattern by my great-grandmother, as she was a moccasin maker, out of this Corten steel. And the 4th step, which is the last step at the bottom, it's about our future condition. And I'm really interested in where are Indigenous people going today and tomorrow? What materials are we using? And so it is a polished mirror steel. So it's reflecting yourself and also reflecting your environment, which is the park itself. When you're sitting or standing at the tallest step, you have the greatest view. You actually have this vista into the downtown Edmonton core, and you have this beautiful river valley in front of you. And I think that's where you have the greatest perspective. But when you're sitting down at the closest step, which is the future condition, you sort of have the most limited view, so you can really only see too far into the future. And so for me, it's not only just about how you think or do, it's really about your kind of vista and how far you're really able to see. So even though you're far back in history, you can see the perspective, but you can't have the voice. And when you're in the future, you have the voice, but you don't have the vista.
So the piece that I've made is called Iskotu, and Iskotu in the Cree language means fire. It's a very large steel sculpture done in syllabics. The largest syllabics are 6 feet high, and the smaller size syllabics are 3 feet high. I chose to do syllabics because I thought it was very important to convey the relationship between Indigenous language and land. Indigenous languages come from the land. And so for me, I thought it was really important to make visible in the landscape of Edmonton that connection. And I chose Cree because that is my language, and I think it's really important to make our languages visible here. And though it's my language, I'm not fluent in it. And so with this work, I'm really hoping that it can be a catalyst so that we see more Indigenous languages throughout the city, whether it's Cree, Nakota, Michif, Saulteaux. I think there needs to be more of it made visible.
My work at the park, I created 2 concrete turtles. Since it's like an island in the park, and I was kind of thinking of the turtles as Turtle Island. The design I started off with, like, I'm working with the Miskochi Academy here. What I did is I included their logo on the baby turtle. I wanted to dedicate that turtle to them, right? Because they're the next group of people that are going to be doing stuff. The second turtle, I put a sweat lodge on top of the turtle, and then everything around it. I put a woodpecker, which signifies the Papache's people and their history in the area. And then there's, on the west side, I put a thunderbird with the creation of the earth, holding the earth, because it was Jerry Saddleback telling us about the creation story. And on the north side, I put the riverbank, the sediments. That was because of Dr. Dwayne Donald. He told us about the history of that area, the riverbank and the arrowheads, you know, the layers. We're going to put a beaver on that side, a real colorful beaver. The reason why we're making them colorful is because Edmonton is full of, you know, different nationalities. On the bottom, I put a bunch of dancers, all the people that started the whole place out here.
What I created was a rock face, and the images that are incised on that rock face are petroglyph-like in that they're carved into that rock face. They're carved in as circles, so they also imitate beadwork, which is also a common denominator amongst different nations. So many different nations use beadwork, including my own nation. Even though we're coastal, we use beadwork as well. And so I thought that would be a good medium to kind of recognize. So it looks like beadwork, and it shows different images that are derived from different histories. I talked to different elders, and they talked about different subjects and approved what could be on this rock face that would be representative. So that's what the work is about. And the work faces the river and looks across to where the city of Edmonton is the downtown core.
So that video really is a beautiful example of what we can do when we think about truth and reconciliation incorporated into our designs. And so that's really what I wanted to end with, was a few examples and hopefully some inspiration, a bit of grounding in the truth, and some thoughts and ideas of how you can work towards decolonizing the built environment. So thank you so much for joining me today and watching this recording.